Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for CAPA's Health and Wellness series. Tonight's topic is managing difficult children, and our presenter is Dr. Gerard Banez. Dr. Banez is a pediatric psychologist who serves as program director for the Cleveland Clinic Pediatric Pain Rehabilitation Program. He earned his doctoral degree in clinical psychology at the University of Vermont in Burlington and completed a pre-doctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship in pediatric psychology at Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts. Tonight, Dr. Banez is going to be joined by Ellen Dornberg. Ellen is a graduate student at the clinical psychology doctoral program at Case Western Reserve University. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Banez, and he's going to get started. Just one thing before we start. All of your comments are anonymous. Your videos are not shown during the presentation. We ask that if you have questions throughout the presentation to please post that in the Q&A section, and Dr. Banez will be monitoring that section throughout the presentation. So thank you, and Dr. Banez and Ms. Dornberg, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Kelly. So thank you all for joining us on this cold, wintry night in Northeast Ohio. What we'd like to talk about tonight is the title of the presentation is How to Manage Difficult Kids, but more specifically, what we hope to do is give you skills, give you strategies for managing difficult behaviors. And let me just show you our outline for what we want to cover this evening. And before I get into this, Kelly did mention the Q&A section of Zoom. And as I go through this, what I would ask is, if you can and are willing, if you could write into that Q&A what some of the behavioral struggles are that you are currently having with your kids at home. So you could give us some sense of what you're struggling with, and then what would also be helpful for us so that we can really tailor some of our thoughts and ideas to your needs. Is you can also let us know how old your child is or how old your kids are. And that will help us in terms of providing what will hopefully be the most helpful information that we can. But these are the items that we wanted to cover this evening. We wanted to first begin by talking about a skills development perspective on kids' behavioral struggles. And that's the perspective that will underlie a lot of what we'll be sharing with you this evening. In addition, we'll be talking about the importance of a family-based approach to helping kids overcome these behavioral struggles. From there, we'll start with the importance of setting the stage for good behavior by strengthening your bonds with your kids, and also enhancing family rituals, enhancing family organization. From there, Ellen will be talking about teaching kids how to comply, how to follow rules and behave honestly. And then we'll also talk more specifically about what you can do to manage your own thoughts, manage your own feelings when your child protests some of the rules and expectations that you are imposing, which can be a huge part of effective behavior management. So I'm looking right now, and I'm not sure if anyone has entered anything into the Q&A for the kinds of struggles they are having at home. The one thing I will say too, I didn't mention this earlier, is that we have set aside some time at the conclusion of the presentation to answer any specific questions that you may have. But along the way, please feel free to enter your questions into that Q&A section. And if appropriate, we may try to address those within the body of our presentation. If we feel that it may be better to wait, we'll wait until the end of the presentation, but we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So typically when kids come to see us and their parents are concerned about behavior struggles, it's things like their children are being non-compliant, they're acting oppositionally, they're acting defiantly, they throw tantrums, they refuse rules, they try to fight against those rules. We talked earlier about the importance of a skills development perspective. These kinds of problems, non-compliance, oppositionality, and defiance, are very common problems. All kids struggle with these kinds of issues now and again. How they vary is that some kids will present with these problems more frequently. Other kids will present with these struggles more severely. These problems, from our perspective, are often best seen as reflecting developmental struggles. And by that, kids have these problems because they haven't yet developed the skills necessary to function more adaptively, to function more appropriately. For example, the child who acts impulsively or doesn't think before what he says or what she does hasn't yet learned appropriate self-control strategies. Kids who are having trouble getting along with others have these struggles because they may not have the social skills, they may not have the social problem solving skills needed to get along and be able to interact more appropriately. Kids who have anger issues, they throw tantrums, or kids who get overwhelmed with depression, anxiety, those kids are often lacking in the emotion management skills or the emotional control skills needed to regulate themselves in terms of emotions. So to be successful, kids who struggle with these issues need to develop the appropriate skills, ones that are normal developmental skills that they need in order to function more effectively. They learn these skills in everyday interactions, but for some kids, it's a slower and it's a more difficult process. The good news, and what we hope to share with you tonight, is that these skills, the self-control skills, the social problem-solving skills, strategies for managing emotions, these are ones that can be taught explicitly. And a lot of our focus today will be on what you as parents or as family members can do to facilitate or foster the growth of these skills. So when we talk about a family-based approach, why is that important? Why is it so important for parents to be learning this information, hearing these things that we want to talk about? It's important because kids do not grow up in a vacuum, and they learn through their interactions with other people in their world. Most of all, they learn from their parents, but they also learn from their siblings, their brothers and sisters, their grandparents, their uncles and aunts, and their cousins. So important that parents and family members work together, are united in terms of helping kids learn the skills that they need. What you model in your words and actions, what you prompt your kids, what you praise, how you reinforce, and what you punish can make a huge difference in how kids behave, in how they learn these skills and learn to function adaptively. When kids and parents come to me because of concerns about behavior, The very first thing I emphasize and what I prioritize is the importance of a positive approach. So think of a positive approach as setting the stage for good behavior, for better behavior. This positive approach sets the stage for the skills development that we want to see in our kids who are struggling with behavior. So, why is this positive approach so important? It's important because behavior problems like oppositionality and defiance can erode parent child relationships. Power struggles can create a wall between parents and kids where more of the interactions parents are having with their kids are negative, fewer positive interactions. A strong relationship between parent and child is important because it encourages compliance, it encourages better behaviors. Think about the various bosses that you've had in life. All of us have had really good bosses, ones that we like, ones that we respect. We've also had some not so good bosses. If you think back to your experiences with different bosses, with different supervisors, when you like and when you respect, when you have a good relationship with a boss, you're more motivated. You're more willing to put in the work. You want to do a good job. Conversely, when your boss is not someone that you like and respect, you're less motivated. You're not going to work as hard for that individual. The same happens in parent-child relationships. The importance of building that strong relationship is to motivate your child to do better, to learn these skills, and to be more adaptive and functional. So what are the ways that we can build that relationship or strengthen that bond? We can do that with our activities, the activities that we do with our kids. One of the most common recommendations I will make when I am starting with a child and a parent is I will encourage parents to make time for positive and child-directed activities. So I actually say, make a date, make an appointment with your child. Specify what day, specify what time, and make a plan. And that plan should be you are going to do with your child something that your child wants to do, something that your child will direct. So that may be we're going to do a art project or a craft together. Maybe she has a favorite TV show that she's been asking for you to watch with her. Maybe it's going in the backyard and playing catch, or it's going on a bike ride. But the key here is that you are setting time aside and being respectful of that time. And that time is set aside for a positive activity of your child's choosing that he or she will direct. Another way to strengthen the bond is to make time for special conversations. Maybe at the end of the school day when your kids come home, or at the dinner table. Maybe it's before your child goes to bed, but make the time to engage in that conversation, to show interest, give attention. Another way of strengthening the parent-child bond is to get more involved in your child's activities. Volunteer to be a coach or an assistant coach. Get involved in what's going on at school. There's so many different things that you can do. Be the mystery reader in your child's class. Kids love that when their parents show up to be involved in those kinds of things. And any of these activities will serve to strengthen your bond with your kids. Another way of strengthening the parent-child bond is through rituals. So examples are daily family rituals, like having a regular dinner time. There has been so much research on the importance of value of sitting down together as a family to have dinner on a regular basis. Kids whose families eat dinner together on a regular basis do better in school, they do better socially, they do better emotionally. So many benefits to that. Have special family rituals like holiday traditions. I was thinking about this earlier. What are some traditions that our family has developed over time? One of the stranger ones, but maybe not so strange, is that on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, at some point, we began a tradition of we were going to order out and have Chinese food on Black Friday. How that started or why that started, I don't know, but it's become a tradition. And even this year, when we weren't able to get together with extended family, like we normally do, and like we normally have our Chinese meal with, the kids still wanted to order out. And the thing I've learned, again, maybe it's not so weird, is whenever I go on Black Friday to pick up our Chinese food, the place is packed. So maybe we aren't the only ones who do this. Other people have developed this tradition. Community rituals, especially for those of you with kids who are a little bit older, volunteering together, helping elderly neighbors together. Those sorts of rituals and activities, again, serve to strengthen the parent-child bond. Now, an important piece on this is that with these relationship building activities, these relationship building rituals, these are not contingent on your child's good behavior, meaning if your child misbehaves, then we're not going to have our special time. No, we are doing these to set the stage for good behavior. So if you have the time set aside, if you have these rituals and traditions, respect and honor those. These are not contingent on your child's behavior. And then the last thing I wanted to speak to was the importance of family routines and organization. Again, these are critical and important for strengthening the parent-child bond and setting the stage for good behavior. So, have a regular wake-up time. What we know is that when kids are waking up at the same time each and every day, they're sleeping better, they're more rested. Because they're more rested, they're likely to have a better behavior day. I talked about regular meal times earlier. Scheduled time with friends, scheduled time with families, those are also very important. Other things to consider in terms of routine and organization and how they set the stage for good behavior. Establish regular homework time, regular homework expectations, especially now with so many kids continuing to attend school virtually or maybe in a hybrid fashion. Having a regular schedule for schoolwork, having a regular routine is helpful to kids. Generally, it's more specifically helpful to ensure that kids are getting the work done that they need. Regular shower or bath times can be helpful, especially for those kids who don't like to regularly shower or take baths. Having a time set aside, a predictability or routine may facilitate that. And then finally, this is the bookend to the regular wake-up time, having a regular bedtime. So going to bed at the same time each and every night, following a bedtime routine or ritual can make a huge difference in how kids settle into their nighttime routine. So again, before I turn it over to Ellen, start with a positive approach. Often parents, understandably, when they're struggling with their kids' behaviors, their question or their ask is, what do I say? What do I do when my child misbehaves? We have some ideas about that, but know that what you put in on the front end in terms of the bond, the relationship, the routines, the organization can go a long way and a lot of the way in promoting better behavior and the learning of these behavioral skills that kids need to learn.
Dr. Banez, this is Kelly Lazar. Before you turn it over to Ellen, I just wanted to remind our participants to use the Q&A to ask questions. Your questions are anonymous. So please, if you have a personal question or something that's going on that you would like Dr. Banez to address, please use that Q&A section, and then they can address it. Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Well, thanks, Dr. Banez, and thank you everyone for being here this evening and listening in. So as Dr. Banez said, so important to sort of really form this important positive foundation and positive approach, and really thinking about it like a foundation is something that you can consistently come back to and rely upon. But the reality is that sometimes things don't always go so well, and we want to have enough tools in our tool belt to be able to deal with sort of difficult behaviors that come up with our kids and teens. So I want to focus on a couple different areas like Dr. Banez covered, thinking about how to teaching your child how to comply, how to follow rules, how to behave honestly, and then we'll talk a little bit about managing sort of those inevitable protests that come up from your kids and teens. So consider these a little more of the how-to. And as Kelly said, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Those are anonymous, or let us know at the end. We'll leave a little time for questions. So to start out, thinking about how to teach your child how to comply with expectations or commands given, most importantly, it's great to start at the very beginning of giving an effective command. So thinking about how we actually phrase the thing that we're trying to get our child to do. There's a couple really important features, both verbal and nonverbal, that are important to keep in mind. First off, eye contact, making sure that you're actually in the same room with your kiddo. We can all relate to sort of the shouting down the stairs or from a different room, but actually having that sort of physical closeness can be really important. A slightly raised voice. We always use the term a friendly robot if you're able, because we want to avoid yelling, but at the same time we want to make it clear that it's a command is different than just a conversation. Also avoiding something as a question. If we want to phrase something as a command rather than a question, sort of not allowing for the option for the child or teen to say no. So rather saying, would you please go put that away? And then they say no, just saying, please go put that away, and phrasing it more as a command than a question. Also important to be clear, specific, and one step at a time. So trying to avoid vague commands like please stop that, or now's not the time, or general vague commands such as that can help us to be much more effective. Questions, like I said, or trying to give multiple or frequent commands all at once. Please go upstairs, put your shoes away, make the bed, come back down, get ready for dinner. That's about 6 commands all at once. And it can seem like a small ask from the parent or family side of things, but we want to make sure that we really break things down to get them done. And also simplified language, keeping a command to 10 words or fewer if possible, and trying to avoid those that vagueness that I spoke to as well with commands. I see we have a question in the Q&A, so I'm just going to take a quick look at that. Do you have any suggestions about how to deal with routines and co-parenting, specifically when children experience different routines and schedules at each parental house? Routines and co-parenting. So I know Dr. Banez spoke a little about routines, so I'll kick that back to him.
That's a really important question, and I think one that deserves some time and attention. So my preference here is we Ellen will continue with the presentation, but that I definitely want to get to that at the conclusion of our presentation.
Sounds good. Alrighty, so I will go on through. Alrighty. So after we give an effective command, we want to couple that with an effective warning if that command is not being met. So sort of these are steps to do if the previous step didn't work so well. So after we've given that short, specific, effective command phrased as a statement rather than a question, same room as the child, and sort of that strong yet friendly voice still, if we're still getting any sort of resistance or just non-reaction or non-compliance, we want to follow up with a warning rather than an immediate consequence. And it's often really helpful to phrase those sort of warnings with an if-then statement. For younger children, we want to think about linking that if-then warning to a timeout. So you're linking the if the command isn't followed to the then to a consequence. And for younger children, we find timeout to be consistently, and evidence supports this, the best option in terms of a punishment or a consequence. And so an example of that kind of statement would be, if you don't put your shoes away, then you will go to timeout, if clothes have been left all over the floor in front of the front door, for example. And for older children or teens, we want to link that warning with a privilege removal, which is often a more appropriate and developmentally appropriate consequence rather than a timeout. So sort of being mindful of your child's developmental age. So an example of that would be, if you don't, put your phone away during dinner time, you're going to lose TV privileges after dinner. And we want to think about privileges specifically for privilege removals that are more wants rather than needs. So specifically in the current context we're in the pandemic, thinking about, we can all see the need of social connectivity and, being able to talk to friends in the ways that we're able and connect with peers. That's really important for our kids as well. So I think specifically thinking about removing privileges that are wants, sort of extras, such as tablet use or TV use, or getting to stay up a little later, or getting to do an extra activity rather than something that's more consistent or needed, such as basic needs like dinner or sleep or connectivity with a close friend or family member. And then the privilege can be removed until the command is completed, or it can also be removed for a set amount of time, like 24 hours or until the next day. And it's just important to be consistent with establishing that consequence up front, so that it's not decided upon in the moment. So moving right along, so thinking specifically about timeout and what that will look like. So it's important to have a chair or a space dedicated for timeout set up ahead of time. I think timeout is one of those things that a lot of parents and family members have tried it. It can very easily go wrong or incorrectly, and I think it's something that can be really important to know the basics of. And you want to think about that timeout space as something where there's nothing to distract or entertain the child, but you can also keep an eye on them. So sometimes this may be, sitting on the bottom step of the stairs if there's stairs in your household, or, sitting in a certain chair in the kitchen if, you're getting ready for dinner or a meal towards the end of the day, and having sort of a space dedicated like that, rather than sending a child or teen to their room where they're likely to be entertained and have things to play with, and it's really not actually serving the consequence that you want it to serve as. We also want to think about actually gently physically guiding the child over to the timeout space when it begins, rather than ever becoming a physical power struggle or just asking them to go on their own, because sometimes then we'll have some resistance and possible opportunities where we have to implement another consequence. So actually escorting them over to the timeout and starting the timeout once they're sat down in the chair or in the space that's dedicated. When we think about length for timeout, research really indicates that it's best to give 1 minute for every year of a child's age. So for example, 8 minutes for an 8-year-old, 5 for a 5-year-old, and really that goes back to developmental appropriateness as well. It's also really great to use a timer for several reasons. Number one, it allows you to keep track of things, because it can be really easy to lose track of those 8 minutes. Number two, it gives some salience or openness to the child about how long their timeout is, and they can hear the timer starting. Luckily with things on our phone like Siri, or if you have an Alexa or a Google Home or one of those devices in your home, it makes those kinds of things really easy. It also helps to take the onus or the responsibility of the timeout off of your shoulders a little bit. So then it's sort of more like the timer is responsible for the time still going on, rather than it being parent or family's fault that the timeout is still going on. And then it's really important to make sure that we repeat this timeout cycle until the command is obeyed. So just persisting through the timeout and then going back and the child not completing the command is not an effective use of the timeout. We never want to forget the command that was originally given and why the timeout is being administered. So for teens, we talked about a consequence for noncompliance being more appropriate to choose privilege removal. So we want to make it really clear that expectations are set up for privilege loss. And sometimes it can actually be helpful to go through this ahead of time with your teen. So rather than just all of a sudden taking away phone or TV or extra social event with friends that wasn't typical, or a special privilege or a trip somewhere, talking about what a privilege loss would look like beforehand for noncompliance can sometimes be helpful to actually role play the kind of consequence without actually administering it, and then having a small possible reward for the teen for going through that role play with you. Sort of sets up the expectation in the same way that we have laws and rules and regulations, and if those get violated, we know what the violation was for and what the expectation was. And then we want to make, similar to the timeout, we want to make the restoration or the giving back of that privilege contingent and reliant on either the command being completed or when the time has elapsed, whatever we established to begin with. And I see we have another question, so I'm just going to quickly take a look there and make sure that I address it, unless it's something we want to wait till later on. Regarding timeouts, what about a child who refuses to move to this set location and just drops to the ground and makes it impossible to guide them there? That's a great question. Sometimes we'll call that falling out, sort of where they just, it makes it almost physically impossible for the child to stand there. What I have been guided typically, and please feel free to jump in, Dr. Banez, you're the expert, in those sort of situations would be to actually remain close to the child to make sure that they stay safe, so that they're not, banging their head or throwing things or kicking or potentially hurting themselves or another in the area. It's best to maintain sort of that friendly robot voice. You don't want to start a physical altercation. My recommendation would be to really just sort of stand there, hover over them, and sort of invoke, I'll talk about this a little later, just this broken record technique of like, we can't start your timeout until you go up and get to your timeout chair. And then if there's continued resistance, we can start adding on minutes to the timeout as an increased timeout and an increased consequence, so that the lying on the ground almost becomes its own behavior that needs to be consequenced. And I think we want to give a couple chances for success. So if that's the immediate reaction of the child, we can sort of provide a warning, like, I'm going to count to 5. And if we don't get up off the ground and go to our timeout, I might have to add another minute onto the timeout. And then we just have to follow through with that and be consistent. And we may get that kind of resistance. So we'll talk about that a little bit with managing protests. But as long as we toe the line and stay with that, the ultimate goal is for the timeout to be over. It can be helpful sometimes to also remind the child that as soon as you go to timeout, the sooner it will be over, as a way to sort of, get them over there a little more quickly. Alrighty.
So,
sorry, I'm having a little trouble exiting out of the box for some reason. There we go.
and then I am having trouble right now advancing to the next slide.
Maybe if you just try clicking on the PowerPoint itself, that just worked for me to get rid of the Q&A box. There we go.
There we go.
Perfect. So in terms of following rules, so switching gears just a little bit, although really related, we really want to think about house rules just slightly differently when we're thinking about commands, because commands come up all day long as parents and caregivers, right? There's lots of commands we have to give to kids all day long and teens that are really needed. House rules are really referring to more consistent things that we want to have as clear expectations in the household. Some common ones I'll work on with parents may include, be respectful with our bodies. That could sort of be covering, keeping our hands to ourselves and, making sure that we have nice hands. That's another term we'll use, or using respectful language in the household. They can also be things more related to schedules or routines or being at a place at a certain time. It's really important when we're thinking about these sort of house rules to try and keep the list as short and concise as possible. We want to keep that kind of same consistent language also, but also writing down and actually posting these house rules in a fairly visible place. When we're thinking about house rules, we also want to think of coding them as do's rather than don'ts. So examples of that might be sure to be ready for the bus at 7 a.m. on school days instead of don't be late for the bus. We always want to phrase things positively so that we're thinking about what to do rather than what not to do, and trying to avoid things such as no, don't, stop, or quit it, that kind of language. It's also important when we're thinking about house rules as some opportunities we want to create for success. I always advise parents and families to try and think about a rule that your child or teen is already partially following, or even following about 75% of the time, because that can be really helpful to include that as a house rule so that they can actually feel successful about achieving some of the house rules on either a daily or a few days a week basis. If we sort of just start from zero, where all of these house rules are not yet being achieved, it'll be hard for the child to feel like they're achieving anything or successful from the start. So it's good to have that kind of buy-in. It's also important to think about following through, potentially with consequences to enforce rules. There's the positive approach with following through, as Dr. Banez spoke to, and always great to start out on that foot. That really puts the onus on parents and family to think about regularly monitoring rule following and providing that kind of verbal feedback. So rather than only noting when rules are being broken, really making sure we pay attention to when rules are being followed, and also followed consistently. And we also want the house rules to be a sort of a part of the general conversation, so that we don't only have to call upon them once in a blue moon or when something goes wrong. We want them to be a part of the daily conversation in the household. It's also good to think about house rules, how they can apply to multiple people in the household. If you have multiple children, or even sort of modeling, following the house rules as adults in the household, that can be a nice way for them to be really communal. And also providing that positive verbal feedback. Let's say if one of them was using respectful language in the household, and you notice that your child or teen was really respectful with their siblings or parents that day, saying, hey, you used really respectful language today. That was really awesome. And giving it that kind of verbal and specific praise for the child so they can know what they did correctly. When we see the opposite occur, where we see rule violations, we want to think about automatic consequences and closing the time gap as much as we can between a rule being broken and a consequence being administered, so that the child knows that that consequence is directly linked to that rule being broken. And when we think about privileges for older children or teens being earned or lost, we can sort of do that depending on how well house rules are followed. So we can use this as both an earning system, not just a consequence system. So there's different methods for this. The same day method might be a little more appropriate for younger children. So sort of, allowing them to earn something that evening for following house rules well, or losing privileges that evening for rules not being followed correctly. The advantage of that is that it's more immediate and closer to the actual rule violation. The disadvantage is that sometimes it can interrupt with nighttime behaviors. And then there's the next day method, which may be more appropriate routines, where rules that are not followed the day of are then consequence the day after. They lose a privilege a day later. And that sort of has the opposite advantage and disadvantage, is that it's a little further away from the behavior, so relies on the child or teen actually remembering and sort of calling back upon what they did incorrectly, but it also is more that doesn't disrupt the activities going that evening, and allows for things maybe such as homework completion or just necessary nighttime activities. So next I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about thinking about teaching your child to behave honestly in the household. So reducing dishonesty in another sense. All right, so first off, we want to think about that it's important to notice when dishonest behavior occurs. So just calling out the dishonest behavior as it happens, and not just letting it sort of slip under the rug or go unnoticed. And actually applying some verbal attention to that can be really helpful. We often might recommend what's called a 5-minute warning rule, where you can say directly to the child, I think that you're being dishonest with me, or I don't think it happened that way. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about it and come back and tell me. And if I don't hear the honest answer in 5 minutes, there's going to be a consequence, and then we'll be consistent with the kind of consequences that we lay out to begin with. And then we want to provide mild to moderate consequences for dishonesty, sort of based on the actual infraction and also denial of the infraction as it goes. So I would say a mild, consequence, potentially an immediate timeout or a privilege removal for just the fact that, a lie was made, but then it was admitted to. If the dishonesty happened and then continually is denied, we actually tend to tack on to that consequence, so that we're punishing not just the fact that the child was dishonest, but that they continue to lie about it and sort of are digging themselves in the lie in that hole, so to speak. It's also really important to think about follow-up activities, arranging an apology and a restitution. So for example, if a lie was made that maybe negatively affected a sibling, about taking something that wasn't theirs, apologizing to the sibling, giving the toy back, monitoring that process to make sure it goes smoothly. If it was an incident related to stealing, perhaps stealing from a parent or a sibling within the home or even outside the home, making sure that that stolen object or money or whatever it was is returned and an apology is made on site, and the parent or family member being there to monitor that restitution. And then also helping the child to understand how dishonesty impacts others. And this is a kind of conversation that's important to have more after the fact, after the behavior has been addressed, after emotions have calmed down a little bit, where you can actually have maybe more of a rational conversation about why it's important to be honest and how that specific instance of dishonesty was negative for other people. And it's not a situation to blame the child or the teen or to make them feel guilty, but to really show that you want them to understand why dishonesty is not a good way to be to others, and how it negatively affects others, and how it can negatively affect other people's opinion of your child. If it's harder to have a conversation about that, sometimes a good follow-up can be actually to have the child write a short letter about their experience or why it's important to be honest. And then we also want to think about promoting the development of honesty within the home, promoting rule following. And this goes back to our house rules a little bit. So thinking about how we can externalize honesty, maybe tack on honesty into one of the house rules, or praise honesty as it's happening in the house. Things happen, playing with siblings, something breaks. If it's a whodunit situation, praising the child for saying, it was me, I was being a little too rough, I broke the toy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. And rather than just saying, okay, and leaving the situation, saying, okay, and thank you so much for being honest with me about that. I know that might have been hard for you, and really kind of praising that behavior. It's also important, and this is especially relevant in the teen years, to maybe increase that parental monitoring. So thinking about the who's, what's, where's, and when's of your child's behavior whenever they're leaving the house or engaging even in, socializing online. Those sorts of things are all still really important, even though you know the where, but knowing, what website or who children are interacting with. And also helping your child to redirect into honest ways of getting things. So actually earning for honest behavior around the household and outside of the household as well. All right, so finally, really just want to cover this last area about managing child protests. So protesting being, anything under the sun from, not wanting to comply with a demand, or not wanting to comply with the consequence, or not complying with something outside of the home, at the grocery store or at school or at pickup time, wherever it may be. We want to sort of have a protocol for how to address protests, but also think about protests on sort of a severity scale. So mild protests would be anything from complaining about having to go to timeout, or some whining behaviors, or sort of things that are maybe a little more verbal and a little less physical, The best approach really with that is to just ignore. It's called planned ignoring. It doesn't mean that you are not responding to your child or that you're not listening to them. If anything, you're just not feeding into those sort of mild protesting behaviors. And more times than not, those behaviors are just going to peter out because kiddo probably wants you to engage a little bit with that protesting. So ignoring is really that best policy in those situations. For moderate protests, when things, increase a little in their intensity, so maybe there's more screaming and yelling rather than whining, or maybe some slight physical involvement, like sort of moving roughly or jerking out of your arms or, stamping feet on the ground, we want to think about ignoring coupled with timeout or removal of privileges. So rather than engaging in those behaviors and saying, we don't do that, stop that, no, don't, some of those words I said to try to avoid, we ignore what's going on and we just say, we're now going to timeout, or now going to lose a privilege because of, and then list the behaviors of why they're getting those loss of privileges or timeout. And it's also important to say that, same kind of warning, we're not going to get back this privilege, and we're not going to end this timeout until this protesting stops. And we won't even actually start this timeout or this loss of privilege until that protesting stops, because we all know how difficult timeout can go when kiddo is resisting and protesting in the middle of timeout, refusing to sit down, laying on the floor, as one of our participants asked. So not actually even starting that timeout until they're actually seated in the chair or the space that's designated. And same goes for privilege removal. Severe protests are going to be our protests that really involve much more physical altercations. So pushing or shoving, throwing things, involving other objects that could be dangerous. This is where we want to think about ignoring that timeout or removal of privilege and safety precautions, and really sort of thinking about safety precautions throughout if those behaviors are occurring. And with the safety precautions, we may take an additional step to have what we call a cool down in the child's room. And this is not serving as the timeout, but actually just a time for both the child to reduce their severe behaviors and for you, the parent or family member, to be able to step away and sort of disengage yourself a little bit. And that sort of leads me next into the disengaging. We want to think about disengaging in 3 different ways: verbally, physically, and emotionally. And this is disengaging for you, the parent or the family member, from your kiddo, because as we can all relate to, it can be really emotionally taxing on you, the adult in the situation, when your child may be behaving this way in some of these difficult ways. So verbally, we might really recommend things like just saying, I understand. It's validating. It validates the fact that they're upset, while it doesn't make the behavior itself okay. But to them saying, I don't want to go to timeout, this is unfair, you're just saying, I understand, sometimes serves as a nice way to say, I hear you, but I'm not going to change the consequence based on your behavior. Or those broken record techniques, repeating the rules over and over. Timeout is 5 minutes long. Timeout doesn't start until we're calm body and calm words and sitting in the chair. So sort of repeating those over and over, and again, keeping in mind that friendly robot voice. Also physically, we want to think about disengaging and de-escalating. Walking away. Sometimes it's okay to leave a tantruming child on their own, or a protesting child, and come back. Your walking away does not mean that we've given up. It's important to come back, and you want to make sure that that walk away time is not too long. Try to give yourself just a couple minutes, or even just a minute, to calm down and sort of get yourself in a better headspace, where you can come back and make this restitution more effective. And then finally, emotionally. So thinking, having a bit of a mantra for yourself. I'm going to stay calm. I won't let her or him get to me. We are going to get through this. It may be a little hard before it gets better. And sort of giving yourself that credit as you go too. And I think we just have 1 or 2 more slides here, just to give people a heads up on time, and we're reaching towards our question period. But really thinking about, how can we prevent angry outbursts? So rather than dealing with them once they happen, what can we do beforehand, apart from some of those positive approaches that Dr. Banez spoke about? We really want to think about maintaining a state of calm. So that goes back to that modeling. So for your kiddo, actually, to them, keeping that sort of calmer voice, even if they're rising up, trying to keep things simple, trying to keep things non-complex. So maybe moving to a different space or room in the home where other people aren't present, so it's a little more private, and keeping things as calm as possible. Also redirecting an increasingly angry child. Know your child's own signs. If you see them starting to get pretty red in the face or shaking a little bit, if they're angry, or if you start to see them, getting a little physical with a sibling or just in their own body, taking time before that outburst starts to get them to a calm space where they can relax, take a couple deep breaths, and do some more preventative strategies to get them in a better headspace. Also knowing certain situations or times of day that may be angering or triggering for your child. If you happen to know that after school is a particularly tough time, or Zoom fatigue that's happening for a lot of kids that may be in remote or hybrid learning at this time, sort of picking moments sometimes that are best and knowing when your child's going to be at their best versus struggling a little bit more. And then also dealing with angry outbursts repeatedly in an appropriate and proper way, that's actually going to help prevent more angry outbursts later on, because we create more of a system and a routine about how we go about this. And also it's really important to think about the recovery from that angry outburst. Did we come back together at the end of the night? Was there still a hug before bedtime and tucking in, even though we had an outburst and a tantrum? That sort of brings us back to that positive approach about really thinking that we never want to make some of those important traditions and routines and parent-child bond contingent on child behavior. We want to try and make those stable and a foundation, and some of these other things wax and wane, but always being able to come back to that and recover from this angry outburst is important. And then finally, I just want to cover what we call the traffic signal answer technique. This can be a good one just in terms of language, and a final little technique to use for child protests. So thinking almost of how a traffic light works and actually using the colors to represent the language. So green could be, yes, it's a go, you're allowed to do that, no problem. Yellow could be, slow down, let's discuss this further. I'm not going to say yes right now, but we can have a conversation about it. And you can sometimes couple that yellow with giving a time and a place to discuss something. And a red is an absolutely not, I will not change my mind, and it cannot be discussed further. And it helps to really start to categorize these kind of things so that your kiddo will actually start to know if something's going to be a red or a yellow or a green, and they'll sort of adjust their behavior accordingly as well. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Banez.
Yeah, Ellen, thank you. You covered a lot of really important ground very well, so I appreciate that. I just wanted to put in a plug for a book and an author that we do a lot of work with. So much of what we presented this evening in this struggling kids, this developmental perspective, is something that this psychologist, Mike Bloomquist, covers very well in his book, Skills Training for Struggling Kids. This is a book that you can sometimes find in bookstores. I've seen it there, but you can easily get it on Amazon. And this is what Ellen and I are working on, some school-based programming now, and we are using Mike's Struggling Kids program, which is an evidence-based treatment for helping design a lot of that work. So much of what we presented this evening is rooted in or adapted from the Struggling Kids workbook. So if you're looking for a good resource, this is one that I would highly recommend. We have just a few more minutes and wanted to take any additional questions that people had. There was a question that came up earlier that I wanted to get to because I think it's such an important question. And the question had to do with rituals and routines and how do you manage consistency in a co-parenting situation. So when kids are in one household with one parent some of the time, with in another household with another parent the rest of the time. And I saw the question and my first thought was, it's hard enough to try to get parents living under the same roof to agree, let alone a situation where you have two parents and two households. So I very much empathize. I think in this situation, it's critical that you as parents sit down together and carve out a plan. There are differences. And those are going to need to be resolved and negotiated for the greater good or the better good of your child or of your children. So I think a thing to emphasize is how kids learn better when the rules and expectations are the same across settings. So the more consistent the rules, the expectations, the routines and rituals are across households, the faster kids will learn, the better they will learn. Kids will behave better. The challenge, which I hear in the question, is one parent may think that his way or her way is the better way, and the other parent thinks differently. That's very much of a challenge. And a strategy that I would recommend on that is, while there may be some issues that may be of more or lesser importance to your child's other parent, there are almost always some behavioral issues that cut across for both parents that are common and problematic in both situations. What I would suggest is that you arrive at some agreement and shared plan, including expectations and rituals for those problems that are more common across settings. Work on those things first. My experience would suggest that when you work together on those issues, there will be improvement. And that change in behavior, that improvement behavior, may serve to motivate your other parent to work together on some other issues. So first, work on those things where you have some agreement, either agreement on the ritual or agreement this is an issue and this is something that we need to deal with. See that through, and then from there, decide what next. One of the things that is really important here is that when rules and expectations are different, when rituals aren't the same, if kids don't like what they're being asked to do, they're going to start playing one parent or one household against the other. And that's a behavior that you want to nip in the bud as early as possible. So that would be in your discussion with the other parent. That might be one of the other important selling points as to why we need to work together on these things. Are there any other specific questions that people have, or comments, thoughts that people may have on the information that we've presented this evening?
Dr. Banez, this is Kelly. I actually have a question. As a grandparent, as a new grandparent, of a little over 2.5-year-old grandson. So what I've noticed is that sometimes he repeats behaviors even over and over again, even though there is a consequence, even though he's timed out. And he might not do it again right away, but it might be that same day or it might be later. And I often wonder, are you just doing this for attention? Is there a reason for this behavior? Because you know the outcome is going to be a timeout. So I'm just curious.
Sure. I think, and Ellen, please comment on this as well, because you address some of the issues related to this. Kelly, it's another good question, and it may very well be an attention-getting behavior. Where I would start, again, is with the consistency in the rules and expectations. So making clear to your grandchild through what you say verbally, but importantly, how you respond, that this behavior or certain behaviors are inappropriate. They're inappropriate when you're with your parents. They're inappropriate when you're here with me, your grandparents. And that if a child persists in these behaviors, that you and your kids agree on how you're going to deal with this behavior. If it's going to be you're ignoring the behavior, or maybe this behavior results in a timeout or a removal of privileges. Again, the consequences have to be the same across parents, grandparents, and settings. Often though, depending on the behavior, especially the more mild, albeit annoying and irritating behaviors, that removal of attention in the ignoring, especially if behaviors are driven to gain attention, can be the most effective strategy. The challenge is persisting in your ignoring if the behavior is very annoying and irritating. And that's where some of the strategies that Ellen was talking about, those mantras you may need to repeat to yourself, can be very helpful.
I don't think I have anything to add, Dr. Banez. That covered it.
Thank you. I notice you have more questions in the Q&A.
I just saw that.
So next question I see here is, what do you do when your child just shuts down even over the simplest thing? You give them time to cool down, but you're told, get away from me, go away, I don't want to see you, or even running away and hiding in the house. What's going on here? Could be any number of things. My guess, child is still angry about how you responded to his or her behavior. Child may be feeling guilty for her behavior, embarrassed, angry at you. So in this case, you want to give, and every kid is so different, and that's the challenge, but you want to give a child some time to cool down, and let them make some first moves. One of the things that I think is really important with this kind of behavior is, after the timeout, after the punishment, try to start anew. There was a misbehavior, you dealt with it appropriately. Now is the time to, again, start in with that positive approach. The first opportunity you have, catch your child being good, praise and reinforce good behaviors. In doing that, you are conveying the message, okay, that's in the past, it's done, we've dealt with it, I'm not mad at you anymore, we're not gonna continue this, it's not productive to, I'm ready to turn the page and move on. So give your child some time, but then start fresh and try to get things moving as soon as you can in that positive direction. Ellen, anything, other ideas you would have?
No, I think that really covered it. Maybe my only small add-on to that is when, as Dr. Banez spoke about, finding those positive moments as soon as you can, or an outlet to sort of leave that behavior in the past and move on. I think sometimes it's helpful to even just challenge ourselves as adults in kids' lives to find moments to praise that sort of sometimes go without being noticed. So even just sitting on the couch together watching a show, turning to your child and saying, I'm so enjoying being with you right now and watching this together. This time is really special for me. And just trying to not only balance out how many words we give to corrective behaviors or trying to manage difficult behaviors, giving even more of those amount of words to those positive sort of normal times. Because we really want to highlight those for the child in their mind so that they know that those moments exist just as much, if not way more than some of those negative moments.
Final question, what's a good strategy for making kids feel heard and feelings validated? Some ideas I have for that. Again, make time. This goes with when I was talking earlier about a positive approach. You want to make time regularly and predictably to have conversations with your kids, to give them opportunities to share what they're thinking, to express what they're feeling. And I think it's important that you do that to, like I said earlier, strengthen the bond, strengthen the relationship, but to normalize this sharing of thoughts and feelings and to convey to your child that you want to know, you want to hear, and these things are important. So I think that's an important setting the stage for this open expression, which when we work with kids who are struggling with sadness or depression, kids who are struggling with worry and anxiety, what we often find is they have a deficit in expressing themselves, in sharing their thoughts and feelings openly like that. So that's one strategy that you can use to normalize and encourage that. I think too, when you sit down with your kids, especially after some misbehavior and the consequences related to that, that you make time to hear what they have to say and really listen. So give them the opportunity to really tell you what was going on for them, what may be going on. That doesn't excuse the behavior or make it acceptable or appropriate, but it is important that you hear their perspective and you convey to them that their perspective is important. Following from that, I think it's important that as a part of that exchange, that you explain briefly, concisely, in a way that your child will understand why the behavior was inappropriate, why you responded in the way that you did. I always suggest ending those conversations with some kind of question or prompt for when this happens again, how are you going to handle it differently? What's something different you could do so that things go better? And always praise your child, even if you disagree with what he or she is saying, or you don't completely get the perspective. You want to praise your child, reinforce your child for sitting, talking, having that sharing, and because I think that will set the stage again in the future for better things. Important, as I think about that if a cooling off period is needed, allow for that cooling off so you can have a productive, meaningful conversation. So at this point, I think we've answered questions that people have posed. Just wanted to for Ellen and myself, thank you for allowing us to join you this evening, and Kelly for inviting us to be a part of this series. And we hope that the information that we've shared today, our responses have been helpful to everyone. So thank you and best wishes.
Dr. Banez, thank you so much. And Ellen, thank you so much. Wonderful information, so valuable. I know that I've learned many things just and am jotting down notes over here as you all were participating. I wanted to let folks know who were still on that if you are interested in the book that Dr. Banez pointed out in the presentation, that we will be providing those books to people who participated in tonight's presentation. So just reach out to us, reach out to me at my email, and I will be purchasing those books and making sure that you get them. That's lazark@bbhcsd.org. And Dr. Banez and Ellen, thank you again so much. Really appreciate all of your valuable information and insight. Really wonderful.
Our pleasure.
You all have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.